evil does not prove that God doesn't exist. Rather, evil in the world proves that there's a violation of the objectively good standard.
So Abdu, you brought up about suffering. People wonder, where is God in suffering?
Yeah.
Recently, over a year ago, in our neighboring community, Oxford, there was a terrible shooting that took place in the school, and people are still reeling from that. They're still asking that question, where is God in suffering?
Yeah, I remember the day I got the news. In fact, the day it happened, I happened to be outside of the state of Michigan. My kids and we live in a neighboring community here as well. And when my kids were in high school, because of our proximity to Oxford, when the news happened, that school, my kids' school, went into lockdown. And for that briefest of moments, I remember my daughter telling me that she didn't know if it was happening at our school. And so that terror creeps in that ever briefest of moments, but it's enough to shake you up. Can now translate that to the actual school where this is happening, and you can multiply that by about 1 billion of the actual terror people were experiencing, and the heartbreak and the tragedy and the sorrow. I got the news. I was in Nashville at the time, actually visiting a friend, and I had to cut my trip short because the first thing I thought to do was to talk to the pastors in this area who I have had the blessing of ministering with, and wondering, is there anything we can do? And the first thing they thought of was to say, why don't you come up and we can do some Q&A with the kids at the youth groups. And they were being flooded. The youth groups had quite a surge in attendance. And I was also blessed to speak at a person's home with a bunch of kids from Oxford, actually, about, I'd say, a week later, who had very serious and deep questions. And the primary question was, where was God in this? How can I reconcile the idea that God is good and God is loving with a God that allows such horrible tragedy? Because the argument is pretty tough, It
is.
They ask the question, if God is good, he would want the suffering to stop. If God is all powerful, he could make the suffering stop. Yet the suffering hasn't stopped, so either he's not good or he's not powerful, or, as the skeptic might say, maybe he's not even there. And it's a tough question, It's a tough one on an intellectual level. On a biblical level, the Bible actually addresses this, but then it comes down to, where does all this stuff actually meet the road? Where does the rubber actually meet the road in our lives? So I like to first proceed from the philosophical, from an intellectual level first, is because the question is never just intellectual, is it?
True.
It's always personal, because it's either about someone who has suffered or it's asked by someone who has suffered. And it's a very deep and personal question. A skeptic might ask the question, not only where is God in all this, but they might say, is there any purpose in all this? I recall sitting across the table from a friend of mine who'd lost his mother when he was 10 years old. And he asked that question. He's like, my real question isn't even philosophical. He didn't say those words, but he basically said, I want to know how this God can possibly be good or value me and my mother when he let her die when I was so young. For him, it wasn't just a philosophical question. We had been discussing philosophy up until that point, but that's when the conversation became very pointed, and the philosophical rubber had met the existential road. And now he not only needed a philosophically satisfying answer, but a personally engaging answer that could say that maybe there was purpose behind my mother's death. And he was an atheist when he asked that question. So I began to answer that question in this way. And this is part of what I shared with the high schoolers, the students, when I met with them, having come back up in the wake of the awful evil and tragedy of what happened in Oxford. The first thing you have to ask yourself is, when we say, where is God in all this? What we're already presuming something, and that is that this thing is evil. Of course it is. But when we say it's evil, what do we mean? Do we mean that it's inconvenient because, evolution has told us that we're here because, the might of the strongest dominated the weakness of the weaker, and we happen to be here, and so it's evolutionarily inconvenient for people to kill each other? Or are we saying it's actually morally wrong? And we're saying the second part. So when we say something like this is morally wrong, that if God could have stopped it, he should have stopped it. Do you see how we've snuck in something? When we say he should have stopped it, we've snuck in the idea that there is an objective moral standard. That moral standard is, the determiner between good and evil. And so if something is objective, that means that it doesn't depend on human opinion. Because think about it, I mean, I don't know what your favorite color happened. What is your favorite color?
Pink.
Pink. Okay, so your favorite color is pink. Mine's red. Okay, so very similar, but not exactly the same. If I were to say red's a better color than pink, you would say nuh-uh, and I'd say uh-huh, and you'd say nuh-uh, and we would just back and forth. It's completely subjective.
Yes.
It's based on my opinion. It's based on the subject. But if I were to say Abdu's favorite color is red, that is objectively true that my favorite color is red. See the difference?
I do.
It's not a personal opinion. It's just you're saying the fact is that's his personal opinion. It's wrong to kill babies for fun. That's not a subjective opinion. That's an objective reality that I think most of us would say is true. So for morals, for something to be evil or good, objectively, it has to not be based on human opinion. But here's the problem, Penny, is that if human beings are the only thing, if we're the highest form of creation, if there is nothing above us to give us the moral standard, then we're the ones who decide what's right and what's wrong.
And we can't.
And we can't, because it's based on our opinion. And if history has shown us anything, human beings are terrible at this. I mean, it wasn't too long ago where it was legal in this country to own people as property just because of their race.
It's terrible.
And it's immoral. It wasn't moral just because it was legal.
Right.
It was immoral then. It's always immoral. That's objective.
So the higher standard is God.
It has to be.
Always.
It has to be, and here's why. Because logically speaking, it has to be. Because if human beings are the determiners of what's right and wrong, that shifts based on who happens to have the most votes or who happens to have the most influence in that particular culture at that particular time. But if there's a standard above us, and that's a moral standard, it's important for us to know this. Morality is not just something. It doesn't just exist. Without getting too philosophical, Plato tried this. Plato tried to say, we don't need gods to demonstrate what's good or not, because even the gods are subject to morality. Morality is a rule that even the gods have to follow. But for the Christian, this is not a problem, because morality is not a rule that God follows. God is the source of the rule, because he is the good. He is objectively good, because goodness is not good, justice is not just, compassion is not compassionate, because those things don't do anything. Those are just concepts, they're just ideas. So if goodness is not good, then it violates itself. It can't be its own standard. So what I'm saying is that has to result, goodness can only be something we are obligated to follow if it's rooted in a person, because things and concepts and ideas are not good.
That's true.
But a person is good. A person is just. A person is compassionate. So if there is a thing such as objective good, transcendent good across all times for all peoples, then that good has to be centered in a transcendent person. And that's exactly what the Bible describes as God. So when we ask the question, where was God in all this? As if we're asking, there can't be a God. We're actually presuming that morality exists objectively. And if morality exists objectively, then that morality can only exist if God exists. So evil does not prove that God doesn't exist. Rather, evil in the world proves that there's a violation of the objectively good standard. Evil is not a thing. Evil is the violation of that which is good. And so goodness has to exist. It can only exist objectively if God exists.